Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and very warm welcome to the World War II in the south of France, both for those present here and for those who are watching through the ether online. And must say, what a treat it is to be talking again in this historic building with all its memories. And congratulations to the museum team for recently receiving a TripAdvisor Traveler's Choice Award for 2024. Well done, Bex. Great. Right. So stored in my memory of the Peninsula Barracks era is the booming voice of Black Mac, Ian McCausland, shouting out, "Jumbo, come here," as his black and white Springer zigzagged across the parade ground. But anyway, following in that vein, I'd like to dedicate this evening to the memory of both Henrietta Hen St. Aubin, who recently passed away at 92, and her husband, the late, great Major Tommy, who was of the 60th Rifles, who died in 2012. They were extremely popular couple, lovely people, great friends of our family, staunch supporters of regimental causes, and of course the wider St. Aubin family having long-standing regimental connections that goes back to include Hen's brother, Joe Studham. So now we're off to the south of France and to Saint-Tropez, with its images of Tahiti and Pamplona beaches, playground of celebrities and rock stars, where Mick Jagger married Bianca, and home, of course, to Bibi, Brigitte Bardot, who incidentally is going to be 90 next week. Therefore, you might think not a location for conflict and war. Looking down impassively on all these frolics has been La Citadelle, Saint-Tropez's 400-year-old, finely chiseled fortress protecting the strategically important former fishing village and maritime safe haven, being well sheltered with nice sloping beaches. And standing in the harbour is a statue of Admiral Suffren, the Nelson of France, with his full title being Comte Pierre-André de Suffren de Saint-Tropez, 1729 to 1788. And from the same era, Royal Navy Captain, later Rear Admiral of the Blue, Smith Callis, destroyed 4 Spanish ships nearby in 1742 during the War of the Austrian Succession. Callis's memorial plaque in Bath Abbey notes his intrepid conduct at Saint-Tropez received a peculiar distinction more lasting than marble from his sovereign's hand, George II having commissioned and invested a special medal for Callis. So in the scorching heat of high summer 1944, landing on Saint-Tropez beaches were the soldiers and landing craft of the Allies, mostly Americans and French, as part of the Operation Dragoon invasion into the south of France. And here are some of the ships heading towards Cavalaire-sur-Mer. Historically, Operation Dragoon has very much played second fiddle to Operation Overlord in Normandy, but both Hitler and Churchill viewed Dragoon in a very different, despairing light. But why so glum? Operation Dragoon meant that for both leaders, they could see that the writing was now on the wall in very, very large letters for the end game of World War II. Hitler reportedly said that Dragoon was the worst day of my life, in a rare admission of pessimism, showing how affected he had been by the event. And for Churchill, Dragoon was traumatic too. Firstly, there was Churchill's hurt pride after he'd been overruled by Roosevelt about the operation going ahead. And secondly, Dragoon snuffed out his obsession of getting into Eastern Europe ahead of Stalin, which we'll discuss later on. Churchill regarded communism in almost pathological terms. The Russian Revolution and Stalin's purges still fresh in his mind, arguably even more viscerally than fascism, because communism challenged not only freedom, but also liberalism, free market economy, which were both rooted deeply into Churchill's fibre. By and large, what occurred in the south of France in World War II and Operation Dragoon has been largely overlooked, especially in Britain, for several possible reasons. Firstly, the British input for the invasion compared to the Normandy landings was modest. While Britain supplied some ships and planes, the ground forces were limited to just a parachute battalion. Secondly, Churchill, for the rest of his life, whinged about the operation, not least in his memoirs, and being the heroic leadership figure that he was, by osmosis, Churchill had laid down the template for future generations about how Operation Dragoon and the war in the south of France generally should be viewed. And this attitude still lingers today. At the recent 80th anniversary commemorations for Dragoon on the south coast of France, rather shamefully, conspicuous by its absence, was Britain. So this comparative no-show in the historical accounts of the south of France in World War II is a great pity, because there are so many aspects to the story that makes it as rich and tangy as a Marseille bouillabaisse. During the Second World War, the area was included in what was officially called France Libre, better known as the Vichy government, based in Vichy, an elegant spa town right in the middle of France, and run by the hero of Verdun, Marshal Pétain, as head of state, and Pierre Laval as prime minister. France Libre was governed semi-autonomously after the armistice between France and Germany was signed on June the 22nd, 1940, only to dramatically change in 1942 and again in 1944. In area, France Libre roughly covered the southern half of France, while the northern half was occupied by the Germans. Everyone seems to have their own version of what geographically makes up the south of France. Rightly or wrongly, mine is it is essentially Provence, broadly extending from the left bank of the lower Rhone to the eastern border with Italy, taking in the Côte d'Azur, Nice, Cannes, and the major ports of Marseille and Toulon, as well as Aix-en-Provence and Avignon. So here's the Rhone, this little area. In the middle are both of the Vaucluse, a wild plateau covered in scrubby garrigue and maquis, made famous by the books and films of Marcel Pagnol, and the mountainous Massif des Morts behind the Côte d'Azur, both crucial safe havens for the resistance during the war. Now, during the Roaring Twenties, the many delights of the south of France, which hitherto have been sampled only by a restricted group of European royalty, aristocracy, and the wealthy, as well as the post-impressionist circle of Matisse and Seurat, were now taken up by what one writer has called the boho nouveau. It was open to anyone who's creative, stimulating, fun-loving, sounds like the Green Jacket, and if you had plenty of funds, that was even better, must be the Green Jacket. On the Côte d'Azur, 100 years ago, American novelist Scott Fitzgerald completed his literary obsession while renting a stylish Art Deco property overlooking the Mediterranean. The book's plot was based on observations and thoughts gleaned from wild and frequent partying by Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda among the gilded set on America's Long Island. And here they are. But to get the book written, Scott Fitzgerald knew he needed a change of pace. So, on a recommendation, the Fitzgeralds plus daughter Scotty headed to France in early 1924, financially flush from a previous bestseller and happy to embrace the power of American dollars. They ended up in the Villa Marie at San Rafael, which was 10 yards from the beach and not too far away from Antibes' legendary Hotel de Cap Eden Rock, or the Cap. Staying at the hotel were their American friends, the artistic and sophisticated Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who invited all manner of like-minded people, such as Hemingway and Picasso. So the Fitzgeralds' partying continued, but in a more leisurely manner. The combination of elegant glamour with clear Mediterranean waters and skies inspired Scott Fitzgerald along his literary career. And so The Great Gatsby was born, a morality tale about decadence caused by new money wealth generated by profits from business in the First World War, as well as the Prohibition, and is regarded by some as the greatest American novel of all. And it was published the following year, and although not an immediate commercial success, the muse of the Côte d'Azur inspired Fitzgerald to get on with his next book, Tender is the Night, evoking the Mediterranean atmosphere as the Fitzgeralds rented the Villa Saint-Louis at Juan-les-Pins, now the chic Hotel Belle-Rive. Indeed, the grand hotels stand like cathedrals that celebrate the spirit of the Côte d'Azur. So it seems in a way sacrilegious that SS Hauptsturmbannführer Alois Brunner, right-hand man of Adolf Eichmann, should use Nice's exquisite Hotel Excelsior to carry out a reign of terror under the orders from Himmler to liquidate every Jew in the city within 6 months. So with France at war and Scott Fitzgerald having died in Hollywood in 1940, the sea lapping at the shores of his former playground in August 1944 was a seething mass of ships of all types and sizes, the sky crisscrossed with swarms of planes, while thousands of soldiers and machines waded out of the water and onto the beach. Covering this force was heavy shelling from naval guns and waves of lumbering Liberator heavy bombers, bottlenose Thunderbolt fighter bombers, Seafires, Hellcats, and Beaufighters pounding and strafing the German positions and way into the hinterland. Thus, Operation Dragoon opened on August the 15th, 1944, with various beaches along the Côte d'Azur divided into Alpha, Delta, and Camel sectors, the latter including San Rafael and Saint-Tropez in Delta. And a series of diversionary attacks were carried out by the specialist beach jumper units led by Hollywood heartthrob Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Here he is. From a French perspective, August the 15th is viewed as the real day of liberation because, unlike the Normandy invasion, both the Free French Army and resistance fighters inland played a central role, while the main bulk of the task force and logistics were provided by the Americans. Operation Dragoon is sometimes lightheartedly referred to as the Champagne Campaign, along with stories of French ecstatically greeting their liberators on the beaches by popping bottles of champagne, if indeed is discussed at all. It took the US Army until 1993 to complete its official history of Operation Dragoon. Inevitably, given the blood and the thunder of the campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Pacific, these dominate the historical record of World War II. But nonetheless, the war in the south of France had a very distinctive identity. Not so much a great grinding mass, but more a seething cauldron of sometimes brutal, bitter, and bizarre competing forces and rivalries. As French fought French, Germans wreaked destruction and vengeance, while agents of the British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, walked a tightrope between survival and the firing squad. There was incredible self-sacrifice versus equally self-serving egregiousness, loyalty on one hand and treachery on the other. Meanwhile, a steady stream of stragglers from the Allied armed forces, as well as escapees from the German advance, that included prominent artistic figures such as Marc Chagall and Marcel Duchamp, all made their way to Marseille and other ports until the Germans turned on the Vichy government and took their matters into their own capable hands. Another person caught out by the German advance was the Honourable Stella Gwyn's adventurous daughter, Elizabeth, a rebel deb, who had been sauntering through the French canals in a small boat with her married lover, Charles Gibson Cowan, a rather dubious but magnetic actor twice Elizabeth's age. From Marseille, they sailed east to Antibes and then to Greece, after which Gibson Cowan returned to London, while Elizabeth Gwyn carried on to Cairo and lots of parties, an odyssey that ended with her becoming a household name, which I will touch on later on. Escape routes like the Pateau Léry line in Marseille were literally lifesavers, even if not everyone got away. And throughout the talk, I'm going to dip in and out of discussing the White Mouse, Nancy Wake being her real name, an incredible force of nature whose exploits with the SOE became legendary. When the White Mouse was asked whether it was true that she had killed a German sentry with her own bare hands, the White Mouse would simply draw her fingers across her throat and say, "I don't see why we women should just wave our men a proud goodbye and then spend the rest of the time knitting balaclavas." So here she is. Nancy Wake was nicknamed the White Mouse by the Gestapo due to her ability to evade their traps. While carrying a 5 million franc bounty on her head, records suggest that the White Mouse was the most decorated woman who served in the Allied forces, receiving no less than the George Medal, Légion d'honneur, Croix de Guerre 3 times, Companion of the Order of Australia. And later on, she was the subject of a number of biographies and documentaries. Wartime events in the south of France also work on deeper historical levels. Planning for Operation Dragoon opened up fractures in the relationships between the Allies, while it has been regarded by some historians as a key milestone in the build-up to the Cold War. Additionally, others have contended that it should never even have happened. Its resources better used in Italy, a view that was heavily forever endorsed by Churchill, claiming that he had been dragooned into accepting it and which therefore he gave it its name. And from these often heated planning talks about Dragoon, at one point a fuming Churchill threatened to resign as Prime Minister. What also emerged was the annoying but incontrovertible truth for the British that when the chips were down, when they're making big strategic decisions, America would pull rank on Britain, which had played out on a number of occasions in the war and later, even more dramatically, in the Suez Crisis. The special relationship had its limits. And Operation Dragoon was not only an enormous undertaking, but also operationally successful, with General, later Field Marshal, Henry Jumbo Maitland-Wilson of the Rifle Brigade as Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean, having taken over from Eisenhower. The success also highlighted the huge errors made by the Allied commanders in the Italian campaign concerning the Anzio and Salerno landings previously. To get a sense of these mistakes, you only have to watch the normally implacable Alan Wicker in his brilliant Wicker's War documentary available on DVD, barely concealing his anger and sorrow when revisiting the losses on the Italian beaches he'd witnessed with a war camera unit, venting clearly a lifetime's worth of derision against General Mark Clark, commander of the American Fifth Army at Salerno, as well as US General John Lucas, commander of the Sixth Corps at Anzio. He was accorded the ultimate withering Wicker put-down. He died while ballroom dancing. Yeah. Today, as France grapples with Marine Le Pen's national rally, its deep roots can be traced back to the tangled and kaleidoscopic mass of organizations competing for power in the France Libre during the war, where force and fear ruled. This included the rise of a powerful Marseille-based drug smuggling mafia, aided and abetted by the CIA. And here, Pétain meets Hitler at Montoire in the Loire Valley to officially sign off the France Libre on October the 24th, 1940. Von Ribbentrop is on the far right, with Hitler's interpreter Paul Schmidt in the middle. When the Germans offered under the terms of the 1940 armistice a form of French self-governance based in Vichy, Marshal Pétain agreed in the belief that not only would it save France from further destruction, but it would also provide the launchpad for its great moral and patriotic crusade to restore France to greatness, la révolution nationale. The Vichy government would also be responsible for looking after the French colonies, including much of West and North Africa, with Algeria and Tunisia being the main focus, as well as Lebanon and Syria, where an Allied campaign later in the war was successfully led by General Henry Maitland-Wilson. Hitler's strategic thinking to allow France Libre was principally threefold. Firstly, it would free up forces and resources to be used elsewhere Firstly, Operation Sea Lion to invade Britain, and then Operation Barbarossa. Secondly, by allowing the French to control their powerful navy that was docked in Toulon under the leadership of the pro-German Admiral Jean-Louis Darlan, it acted as a carrot and stick to the French, encouraging them to feel they were still controlling their destiny to some degree, while expecting the French Navy to actively patrol the Mediterranean in return. And thirdly, Germany's Navy was desperately short of capital ships. Its shipbuilding program way behind due to rearmament restrictions imposed by the Allies after the World War I, forcing a crash program of quicker to assemble U-boats. And after France's defeat in 1940, the short-lived Under-Secretary for War, General Charles de Gaulle, refused to sign the armistice, and he fled to London, from where de Gaulle made his famous June the 18th appeal, having arrived only the day before, exhorting the French to continue resisting and to contact him, but comparatively few did to start with, either in England or in France. Now, the foundations for Pétain's crusade had been prepared in particular by Charles Maurras and his Action Française group through articles and lectures to explain what ailed France and how to put that right. These ideas would later influence the military dictatorships of Latin America, especially Argentina. France has been overrun by Germany 3 times in 70 years, with Paris captured twice, beginning with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, as France's destiny throughout history constantly switched between glory and disaster. This created a bipolar sense of history that was summed up by the fortunes of Napoleon. The aims of the Révolution Nationale were to cleanse any sense of humiliation over France's historic failures, invigorate the Catholic Church, root out Jews, communists, and overall to inspire a patriotic pride and a sense of nationalism, which included replacing the famous Marianne Republican symbol with Joan of Arc and the rousing motto of liberty, equality, and fraternity with work, family, and country. Foreigners were also demonized, especially the British. The Germans could not be mentioned, of course. Pétain was a deep Anglophobe, believing Britain had undermined the French throughout history, which was a view shared by his close advisor, Admiral Darlan. Under the terms of the armistice, Pétain and his government agreed to certain conditions. 2 million French prisoners of war to be kept by the Germans for forced labor. Hand over any individual wanted by the Germans. Hand over gold, food, supplies to Germany. Most of the wine went to the thirsty Wehrmacht. Jews and communists to be rounded up by the Vichy police and handed directly to the Germans. And any Allied incursion into France Libre was to be dealt with by Pétain's forces. Under the armistice terms, Pétain was restricted to a volunteer armistice army of 3,500 officers, 15,000 non-con officers, and 75,000 soldiers, plus gendarmerie of 60,000 men and other paramilitary outfits. No tanks were allowed, and berets were introduced as standard uniform. Internal security within Vichy was carried out by a range of organizations under 3 broad headings: official, as directly controlled by the Vichy government; semi-official, working in cahoots with the official organizations, but with no official mandate; and thirdly, freelance, below the radar networks, usually focused on black market profiteering, which was a handy source of covert bribes and muscle for officials using the cloak of secrecy. In the first category belonged the Compagnons de France, a milder version of Hitler Youth, and a pet project of Pétain's to mold the youth of France Libre around the ideals of the Révolution Nationale, eventually numbering 100,000. And one of these was Bernard Fall, his family being Polish Jews who had settled in Nice via Vienna and Paris to escape the Nazi pogroms. And with its substantial stock of pre-war tourist accommodation, Nice became a magnet for refugees, plus its distance from the Germans in occupied zone. The Falls lived in a large communal house with other Jewish refugees, but with no official residency papers and desperately hiding their Jewish identity. they always had to be vigilant. Bernard Fall lived a dangerous double life, using his membership of the Compagnons de France to cover his activities with Jewish resistance groups in Nice and Cannes, starting with soft actions like stealing food and official stamps, before moving to bigger operations that involved killing Germans and collaborators. And later in life, Bernard Fall was the author of a book called Street Without Joy, about the French Indochina War in the 50s, a book that has now gained classic status among military literature. In the second category of internal security was the Service d'Ordre Légionnaire, SOL, founded by Joseph Darnand, who later served with the Waffen-SS and was executed in 1945. SOL evolved into the infamous Milice paramilitary force after 1943, which became the Vichy government's main arm for fighting the resistance and rounding up Jews and communists. In the third category was the Carling, or the French Gestapo, which worked with its German equivalent and recruited mostly from the criminal underworld, which gave it access to informers, corrupt officials, and the black market. Though based in Paris, its hardcore came from the Corsican crime gangs of Marseille, who historically controlled the heroin trade between Turkey and the United States, known as the French Connection, with its later version turned into two epic films starring Gene Hackman. Crime boss Paul Carbone was known as the Emperor of Marseille, who, with his crime partner Francisco Spirito, inspired the memorable film Borsellino, starring those two greats of French cinema, Jean-Paul Belmondo and the recently deceased Alain Delon. And here is Paul Carbone. They were extremely useful to both the Vichy authorities and the CIA in preventing the French communists getting control of the old port of Marseille, and in return, they were given protection. The French Communist Party started in 1920 and was particularly strong in Marseille and Toulon. As for collaboration, once one moves past any overt activity supporting the Vichy government, then the subject matter gets into a grey area. Did compromise with the authorities represent collaboration or just a realistic survival strategy? A famous example of this concerned Marcel Pagnol, the well-known author and filmmaker of Jean de Florette and Manin des Sources, who was born in Aubagne. Oh, does it? Maybe he's told me he's had enough. I don't make a dog's dinner. Pagnol outside. Pagnol had allowed his studios to process a number of Vichy propaganda films, prompting accusations of being a collaborator. Pagnol's response was that the film studios represented a lifetime of creative struggle, and the Vichy engagement had allowed this to continue for better days in the future. To escape France Libre, there were only two realistic options: either to take a boat, often from Canet-Plage near Perpignan, or over the Pyrenees and into supposedly neutral Spain, but which had definitely leaned towards the Germans to the point of setting up wretched prison camps. Then ideally it was onto neutral Portugal and then a boat passage, relying on lots of good luck and cunning. And going over the Pyrenees was physically dangerous and orienteering very difficult. So experienced local guides had to be cultivated. And over time, escape lines were organized, involving a network of courier guides, safe houses, and a supply of forged identity documents and transit visas using stolen rubber stamps. Collectively, the different escape lines, which eventually covered all of France and the Low Countries, are reckoned to have helped 7,000 Allied military personnel, roughly half and half British and American. And the work involved 12,000 people, half being women, and with over 500 being captured and executed or dying in concentration camps. Much of the funding came from MI9, a secret department of the War Office between 39 and 45, which had two main tasks. Firstly, helping escapees from prisoner camps, and also assisting Allied military personnel evade capture if trapped behind enemy lines. And MI9 had some memorable characters. For example, Charles Fraser Smith, a former missionary and inspiration for James Bond's quartermaster Q, who invented numerous ingenious gadgets, as did Christopher Hutton, known as Clutty, who specialized in making mats from silk. And of course, Airey Neave, later to be blown up by an IRA car bomb in 1979, who joined MI9, having previously escaped from Kolitz. Neave was the de facto operational head, to whom fellow Old Etonian actor and humorist Michael Bentine reported. And among the many thousands of refugees heading to France Libre was the Scottish-born Donald Caskie, a minister in the Scots Kirk in Paris before the war. In Marseille, Caskie was allowed by the Vichy authorities to restore the decrepit British Seamen's Mission building on condition it was used for refugees only. However, very soon escapers and evaders, those evading the Vichy police, were now also appearing, but apparently intolerated by Vichy police in the mission, so they could eventually learn about the escape route structures. And in Marseille, the biggest escape line, which developed over time, was the Pat-O'Leary line. Working closely with Caskie was a quietly spoken Seaforth Highlander called Ian Garrow, and his polar opposite, the loud and vivacious New Zealand-born Nancy Wake. A dockside restaurant, La Dorade, became a center for swapping intelligence, while at Le Petit Poussy Bar on Boulevard du Gommier, escapees waited to be contacted about their departure plans. Nearby, Nancy Wake lived in a large, luxurious apartment, having married wealthy industrialist Henri Fiocca, and together, before the war, they had lived the good life of luxury hotels and restaurants. The young Nancy Wake grew up in Australia. Age 19, she used the £200 inheritance to travel to Europe and became a freelance journalist, interviewing Hitler in 1933, after which she resolved to be an implacable enemy of the Nazis. In later life, Nancy Wake summarized her feelings towards the Nazis. In my opinion, the only good German was a dead German, and the deader the better. I killed a lot of Germans, and I'm very sorry I didn't kill more. Well, a chance encounter with a British officer in a Marseille hotel in 1940 led Nancy Wake to join the Pat-O'Leary line, making her apartment available as a safe house, while her husband, Henri, injected the funds. Gradually, Nancy Wake's work expanded to delivering her parcels, as escapees were referred to Perpignan and then the Pyrenees. In June 1941, the Marseille escape group were joined by a former Belgian army medical officer, Albert Géris, and he was to play a significant role. Here he is. Having escaped to England after Dunkirk and resurfaced in Gibraltar as a British Navy lieutenant commander under the nom de guerre of Patrick Albert O'Leary, Géris carried out dangerous work off the French coast, landing agents ashore. Eventually, Patrick O'Leary was captured and imprisoned near Nîmes, but soon he escaped and headed to the Seamen's Mission in Marseille, where he planned to stay only a short time, but he was persuaded to remain. So after Garrow was arrested, Pat O'Leary ran the escape line, which is named after his nom de guerre. During the autumn of 1941, members of the line became suspicious of a colleague they knew as Paul Cole, prompted by the disappearance of funds earmarked for reimbursing helpers. Yes, I don't blame him. Yes, time's up. After being confronted, Cole escaped, but he was later killed in Paris in 1946 by French police, having been responsible for the betrayal of over a dozen key members of the line. The tectonic plates of World War II now moved decisively. On December the 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, prompting the United States to immediately declare war on the Japanese, followed 4 days later by Germany and Italy declaring war on the United States, who immediately declared war on both countries. Since the start of the Vichy government, resistance was low-key, as everyday life broadly carried on with the main concern of the Vichy forces being to respond to the German demands to find Jews and communists. A separate bureau to process the Jewish detainees was set up, while a former factory outside Aix-en-Provence was converted in 1939 into an internment camp. Initially, Camp des Milles housed German and Austrians escaping the Nazis, including a number of prominent intellectuals and artists who whiled away their time painting huge murals, which you can still see today. The comparatively relaxed mood changed in 1942, when Camp des Milles switched from being a wretched deportation camp to being a wretched deportation camp for Jews sent to Auschwitz via the Drancy camp in the suburbs of Paris under the command of Alois Brunner. In August 1942, Nancy Wake was arrested and badly beaten while under interrogation for 4 days without revealing any names. But she managed to escape thanks to a remarkable intervention by Pat O'Leary. Taking the very dangerous risk of using a false identity card of a senior milice official, Pat O'Leary rushed into the prison at Nîmes, demanding to see the commissaire, explaining that Nancy Wake was his mistress and that she had remained silent to escape her husband's wrath. The commissaire replied he fully understood this delicate situation and immediately released Nancy Wake. Nancy could be harsh and swear roughly in French, just as much as Nancy could be charming. With a little powder and a little drink on the way, I would pass the German sentry post and wink at them and say, "Do you want to search me?" God, what a flirtatious bastard I was. So in November 1942, the war's tectonic plates shifted again, with major implications for the south of France. On November the 8th, the Allies launched Operation Torch with 3 landings into North Africa to form a pincer with Allied forces approaching from the east, having just won decisively the Second Battle of El Alamein. And with the whole Mediterranean strategy under threat, the Germans retaliated by launching Operation Case Anton in November 1942, taking over France Libre and thereby terminating the Vichy government, even though it continued in pure puppet form. Meanwhile, Italy took over Nice and neighboring border regions while refusing multiple requests to hand over Jews submitted by the German ambassador to Italy, Hans von Mackensen, whose father, August, had been a leading German general in World War I, and his brother Eberhard had led the German response at Anzio. Now, that's proper kit. Yeah. This is August von Mackensen, known as the Last Hussar. Please note his Totenkopf death's head insignia on von Mackensen's busby, part of historic German Hussar full dress that originated with Frederick the Great. The Totenkopf insignia will be mentioned again later on in relation to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. Number one priority for the Germans was to capture intact the French fleet in Toulon. The French, however, had secretly prepared for this event, firstly by delaying the Germans through drawn-out discussions and subterfuge. Then, as the Germans broke into the docks, Admiral Darlan, who had by now switched sides to the Allies, gave the order to scuttle the fleet, preventing 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 20 submarines from falling to German hands. The resistance fighters now increased their activity for a full liberation war with growing help from the SOE as 2 important French leaders emerged, Jean Moulin and René Char, both from the south of France. Jean Moulin was born in Béziers. He was Mr. Resistance, responding to instructions from London. At 9:15 every night, the BBC's French language service broadcast the first 4 notes of Beethoven's 5th Symphony, followed by cryptic messages. And here's Jean Moulin. And given the rivalries, both personal and political, between the resistance groups, Moulin faced a mountain trying to unify the groups, but he broadly succeeded through huge effort, only to be betrayed and then tortured by the infamous Klaus Barbie that included having his fingernails lifted with red-hot spatulas and then finally was shot. And as to the identity of the betrayer, there have been no conclusive proof, but there have been many names suggested. Poet and novelist René Char was born in the Ile-sur-la-Sorgue, a village in the Vaucluse, later gravitating to Paris and the Surrealist movement. After the 1940 defeat of the French armies, René Char returned to his roots, hiding in the remote village of Sereste, from where he ran the Vaucluse resistance operations under the codename Captain Alexandre. June the 22nd, 1943, witnessed a dramatic turn of events in Marseille. At daybreak, a combined operation of German SS units and French police burst into the old port, and thus the Rafle, or roundup, of Marseille had begun. The Rafle had two purposes: to eject all residents of the neighborhood, as well as rounding up 2,000 Jews. And secondly, to dynamite all the buildings in the ancient Le Panier district, its warren of winding old streets regarded as a resistance haven by the Germans. And here's the Rafle. The Rafle lasted 2 days, directed by Karl Oberg, senior SS and police officer in France, who came down from Paris on Himmler's orders to give instructions to René Bouquet, the most senior police officer in France, who was later assassinated in 1993, shortly before his war crimes trial. Later that year, the Gestapo net tightened around the White Mice. Alerted to an impending raid on her Marseille home, she kissed husband Henri goodbye and planning to get to London via the Pyrenees. But 4 times she had to turn back just ahead of the Gestapo. On the 5th attempt, she was successful, climbing over the Pyrenees for 2 days in raging thunderstorms, but eventually arriving in London. Unknown to the White Mice was that her husband Henri had been captured and tortured by the Gestapo without revealing any information and then shot. It was only at the end of the war that the White Mice discovered the news about her husband's death. During the roundups of Jews in Nice, Bernard Fall's parents were caught. His mother, Anna, was sent first to the Drancy internment camp outside Paris and then to Auschwitz, where she perished. His father, Leo, was tortured by the Gestapo and then he died, after which his body was carried by Bernard in a casket with 4 Jewish resistance friends, risking arrest by the police, to an unmarked grave in Nice. With the White Mouse now in Britain, she trained as an SOE agent with the codename Hélène. At the end of April 1944, the White Mouse, now a captain, parachuted with 2 others into the Auvergne region in central France, complete with her night dresses, cosmetics, and a handbag full of money and a pistol. Unfortunately, the White Mouse had landed in a tree, where she was discovered dangling dangerously by a resistance fighter, Henri Tardivat. "I hope that all the trees in France bear such a beautiful fruit," he exclaimed, to which the White Mouse, rather less graciously, replied, "Cut out the bullshit and get me out of the tree." She made her way to Chaudet, a spa town, which became surrounded by a large German force, complete with field guns and aircraft, up against 500 lightly armed men. And during this battle, the White Mouse moved around in her car, delivering ammunition and encouraging words, with her car being strafed several times as the Maquis made a fighting withdrawal, losing 200 either dead or wounded. And after D-Day, there was a mass uprising by the resistance, with the White Mouse leading an attack on the Gestapo headquarters at Montluçon, timed as the Germans were having their midday meal. 4 carloads of Maquis dashed into the building and cleared each room with grenades and machine guns on 2 floors, and then exited, all in the space of 1 minute. Now, another way to get in and out of France was via the RAF's Special Duties Service 161 Squadron. In December 1942, squadron leader, later Group Captain Hugh Verity, DSO, DFC, took over command of A Flight, and eventually he logged more flights than anyone else, flying both the rugged little Westland Lysander and the larger Lockheed Hudson. The pilots operated without radio communication and only handheld torches to mark the landing strip, with no navigational aids relying on the moon instead. Once, Hugh Verity experimented flying without any moon. I wanted to see how frightening it was. That's why I never did it again, he said. The wild Vaucluse witnessed many of these landings. In the lavender fields outside Salt, in the shadow of Mont Ventoux, there was a secret landing strip, codenamed Spitfire. Here in August 44, a Dakota landed so heavily loaded with passengers that it made the return takeoff impossible. So volunteers got off with a pilot promising to return the following day. Unfortunately, all the commotion alerted the local militia, who shot a number of people as a reprisal the next day, with nobody daring to greet the returning plane, which flew away without mishap. Throughout the Vaucluse, there are many monuments aux morts, commemorating local people killed either fighting or from one of the reprisals. One of the largest memorial being a wall in the center of Saint-Saturnin-les-Apes in the Luberon Valley, commemorating 14 people who were massacred on July the 1st, 44, by the Germans, including 4 where the wall is actually located. Now, Operation Dragoon officially ended after the landings of August the 15th. Operationally, it was a resounding success with all its main targets achieved bar one. And here, While the outcome, in fairness, was never really in doubt, given that the Germans had considered the south of France a low priority and had assembled a hodgepodge force with a couple of exceptions, and being further weakened as the units were siphoned off to Normandy. Nonetheless, there were plenty of pockets of stiff German resistance, while the Allies raced against the clock, as any delay was a day lost repairing and using the ports of Marseille and Toulon before the onset of the violent Mistral season, this being the first key strategic goal. The second goal was to drive up towards the Vosges Mountains, link up with other Allied army forces, and then attack the rural industrial heartland. And the third goal was about the Americans settling deep scores. Following the blame game of the Italian landings, the Americans felt that the British had escaped their proper share of the blame, while the American military image had been tarnished. Thus, American military pride was out to prove a professional point, as they made it very clear that Dragoon would be run our way. Here's the map. You can see the 3 main landings there. So this is August 15th, Marseille by the 28th. Even with the even with the invasion force enjoying almost total air superiority, the fact that Dragoon ended ahead of schedule reflects great credit on the commanders for maintaining a fast-moving blitzkrieg campaign, greatly assisted by the French resistance fighters who blew up bridges, roads, and generally harassed behind German lines. The Allies also had to bear in mind the well-proven German ability to rapidly regroup and launch counterattacks, while in the early Dragoon planning stages, also in the picture was the well-led 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, highly committed to the Nazi Party ideals. Just as an aside for a second, all SS units wore the Totenkopf Death's Head insignia as a mark of their superiority. The Death's Head symbol having many historical interpretations. For Himmler, creator of the SS, it represented, quote, a reminder that you shall always be willing to put yourself at stake for the life of the whole community, end quote. In April, Das Reich, under General Major Hans Lammerding, with 15,000 men and 200 armored vehicles of various types, moved to Montauban, north of Toulouse, chosen so the division could move in any direction. Lammerding and many of his officers were iron-hard veterans of the Eastern Front, gaining a reputation for brutal partisan reprisals. However, Das Reich had been decimated on the Eastern Front to the point that to fight in France, it had been replenished with a large non-German component. Soon after the Normandy invasion, Das Reich moved north to fight, harassed all the way by the resistance, leading to the infamous massacres of civilians at Toul and then Oradour, where the German killing frenzy was prompted by the resistance killing Sturmbannführer Helmut Kampf, commander of the Grenadier Regiment Deutschland. Interestingly, there is a counter-narrative that says it was the resistance who began the cycle of atrocities by burning alive some German prisoners in a car in Toul. In this picture, taken at Montauban just before Das Reich moved out, Lammerding is on the far right of his staff, with Kampf on the far left. The Allies selected the beaches of Côte d'Azur for their gentle sand shelving with no prominent overlooking hills, as well as the defences being weak. It was on a reconnaissance flight here that the writer and aviator Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, author of Le Petit Prince, crashed without his body ever being found. After the landings, no forces turned east towards Nice for fear of diminishing momentum towards the vital western ports. The Allied advance was so rapid that it often outran the supply chain, especially fuel, and led to the only disappointment as some German unit escaped from the Allied net after heavy fighting around Montélimar. The daunting prospect of urban warfare and a repeat of Case Anton destruction in both Marseille and Toulon was simply blown away by speed. The American and French commanders were determined that instead of the defensive mindset and reliance on surprise that had dominated the Anzio and Salerno landings, neither of which had worked, the Dragoon, both the pre-landing bombardment and breakout would be turned up to full max. The German command was headed by General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, in charge of Army Group G operations. There we are, nice fine Prussian. Army Group G covered the whole of southern France. Early in the war, Blaskowitz had blotted his copybook with Hitler for executing 2 SS soldiers for indiscriminately killing a number of Polish civilians. Within Army Group G, General Friedrich Wieser commanded the 19th Army, this being the main force opposing the Allies, consisting of a motley collection of impressed foreign soldiers from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Russia, and Lithuania. The only exception in quality terms was the 11th Panzer Division under Generalmajor Wendt von Wittischam, tasked to be a mobile reserve. All told, the German force was roughly 250,000, with their eventual losses between 7 to 20,000 killed and 130 captured. Blaskowitz later jumped off a balcony after breaking away from his guards during the Nuremberg High Command trials, even though it seemed likely that he actually was going to be acquitted. And opposing them was the US 7th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, made up of the US 6th Army Group under the hard-driving Major General Lucien Truscott, who replaced the ballroom dancing General Lucas at Anzio, with 3 divisions, and the French Army B, consisting of 2 armored divisions and 5 infantry divisions, led by General Jean de Latte de Tassigny. Later, de Tassigny was one of the French commanders-in-chief in the French Indochina War. With his life cut short by cancer, his last words were, "Where is Bernard?" Possibly recalling that as Tassigny lay dying, that he had sent his only son to almost certain death after giving a general order for a key town to be held to the last man. The invasion plan designated the Americans to crack open the beachhead, while an invasion of assault force would attack the German rear, with the French following up behind the Americans. The US 8th Fleet under Vice Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt contained all the amphibious vehicles, as well as 7 British, 2 American light escort carriers, while naval fire came from American, French, and British battleships, with air cover coming from the Mediterranean air forces. In total, 150,000 Allied troops took part in the initial landing and grew to over 500,000. The eventual American losses totaled 7,500 killed and 10,000 wounded, and for the French, 10,000 wounded or killed. Behind the scenes in the run-up to the invasion, there had been another fierce battle going on between Churchill and the Americans. On the surface, it was about war planning, but deep down, the struggle was about who was boss. Dragoon had a fraught stop-start build-up, beginning life as Operation Anvil, to be carried out in conjunction with Operation Overlord. The whole plan was unveiled by US Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall at the Tehran Conference in November 43. Significantly, Marshall's plan was supported by Stalin, whose reasoning was that Anvil would tie up Allied forces far away from the Balkans, which Stalin had heavily circled as a Soviet sphere of influence, and exactly one of the reasons why Churchill was so vehemently opposed to Anvil. As the war tilted gradually in favor of the Allies, Churchill turned his mind more and more to getting into Eastern Europe ahead of Stalin. He famously once asked Montgomery's opinion on Russian requirements to invade the whole of Europe. "Just shoes," said Monty. Churchill liked to informally chew the military fat with various people, and one being Lieutenant General Sir Adrian Carton de Wet, a former Belgian aristocrat who was raised in Britain and whose great-grandson is a former Green Jacket officer, Anthony Lloyd, now a distinguished war correspondent with the Times. Dubbed the unkillable soldier, having been blinded in his left eye, covered by an eye patch, lost a hand, and being severely wounded 8 times, mentioned dispatches 6 times, de Wet received the Victoria Cross at La Boiselle on the Somme in 1916, where he took out the grenade pins with his teeth and threw them with his one hand. Having been commissioned into the 4th Dragoon Guards, de Wet was widely assumed to be the model of the fire-eating Brigadier Ben Ritchie Hook in Evelyn Waugh's Sword of Honour trilogy. Churchill held de Wet in the highest regard, making him the diplomatic representative in China to the wartime leader, nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. The left-hand photograph was taken at the Cairo conference in November 43, showing de Wet on the far right next to Mountbatten, with Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Madame Chiang, sitting in front. And the portrait on the right was taken by Cecil Beaton. In Churchill's view, diverting resources from the Italian campaign with its large British involvement fatally reduced competition to Soviet expansionism across Eastern Europe and the Balkans, as well as the chance to claw back the Romanian oil fields, the lifeblood of the German war effort. He wanted instead to beef up the Italian campaign in tandem with a new operation in the Balkans, with 2 ultimately converging. However, Roosevelt overruled Churchill. So preparations for Anvil wobbled along, but as the combined Overlord-Anvil planning developed, a simultaneous landing looked less and less possible, especially after Overlord was expanded from a 4 to a 5 division front. So, much to Churchill's joy, Anvil was aborted, but not for long. When the Normandy campaign got bogged down, it was obvious that the local ports were too small to cope with the vast Allied supply net. So capturing Toulon and Marseille to create another supply gateway suddenly became top priority, with the added benefits of placating demands by de Gaulle and his Free French generals. So on July the 14th, the Allied Combined Forces of Staff gave the green light for the invasion, renamed Dragoon, with merely a month of preparation before the landings. Churchill, however, huffed, puffed, and unravelled. With 2 weeks to go before the landings, he suggested that Brittany would be a better focus for an invasion than the south of France. Eisenhower, however, just managing to hold back his exasperation, stood firm with Roosevelt's backing, despite Churchill threatening to resign as Prime Minister if Dragoon went ahead. Well, at least history would recall that he had been dragooned. And these rows over Dragoon highlighted 2 fundamental strategic issues at the heart of the US-British alliance. Firstly, the overarching war strategy. Churchill wanted to push through the soft underbelly of southern Europe, through the Alps and into Germany if it hadn't already capitulated. The south of the United States, on the other hand, they wanted to attack Germany via the most direct route, which was through France. And the second issue was the political consequences of the above. As the Russian armies poured into Eastern Europe, Roosevelt was seemingly less concerned than Churchill, knowing that the Manhattan Project was well underway, though the Soviets would shortly catch up as a result of the British adoptive physicist Klaus Fuchs secretly passing on the details. The damage in the Allied relationship from all the buffeting might well have been even greater, but for the efforts of Jumbo Maitland Wilson. He had a calming effect on Churchill, being the general with whom the Prime Minister was most relaxed, the undemonstrative solidity of Maitland Wilson as the yin to the yang of the mercurial Churchill. Here is Jumbo Wilson. Right. I'll move on a bit. With the Allies nearby following the landing, Alois Brunner, who's the head of the Nazis in Nice, continuing the murderous roundups. So the resistance organized an uprising on the night of August the 27th, beginning with a force of 350 and steadily growing to 1,500. The next day, clashes erupted all across Nice while the Germans rained down shells from an old fortress up on the hill. However, at nightfall, the 2,000 Germans evacuated Nice, machine gunning and smashing buildings as they left, while captured Germans later were made to clear their own mines on the beaches. So as we turn to the war's end, here is briefly what happened to the following. Bernard Fall. He joined teams interrogating Germans for evidence used in the Nuremberg trials, followed by a move to the United States. He then yo-yoed between an academic career and long spells covering the French Indochina War in the 50s, from which he emerged his masterwork, The Street Without Joy, and the evocative name given to Vietnam's coastal Route 1, where ambushes and loss of life were frequent. Secondly, Alois Brunner, the terror of Nice. He was born in Austria, joining the Nazi Party aged 16, moving to Germany, where he joined the SS and was then assigned to the Central Staff for Jewish Immigration in Vienna. It was here that he became close to Adolf Eichmann, subsequently organizing the deportation of thousands of Jews from firstly Poland and then Slovakia and France Libre. Brunner personally carried out interrogations and torture while commandant in Drancy, and at the end of the war, Brunner vanished, surfacing in Cairo in the 50s as an arms dealer, and then on to Damascus, where he lived for the rest of his life. Brunner received several letter bombs, losing an eye and fingers on his left hand, and was rumored to have exchanged protection from Assad's intelligence agencies for instruction in interrogation techniques. While no hard evidence of Brunner's death has ever been found, the Wiesenthal Center claims, based on reliable sources, that he died in 2010 and was buried in Damascus. And the White Mice. While she spent her very last years in the Star and Garter Home for Disabled Veterans, the White Mouse for many years lived in Mayfair's Stafford Hotel, where she perched most evenings on a bar stool in the American bar with her gin and tonic. The White Mouse sold her medals to pay the hotel bills, but when the pot ran dry, the hotel and then the current King Charles, then Prince of Wales, supported her. After the war finished, the White Mouse worked in several British embassies before heading to Australia, standing twice as a Liberal candidate in federal elections and then just missing out both times. In 1951, she returned to Britain, working in the Air Ministry at Whitehall, resigning after marrying an RAF officer, John Ford, with the couple relocating back to Australia and then retirement to a Queens and Beach house. There, I seem to have lost the yeah. Right. In 2001, after her husband had died, the White Mouse returned to Britain, and she died in 2011, aged 98, with her ashes scattered near Montlucan, where she had fought alongside the resistance. So after the war had finished, it was not long before the first tourists returned to the south of France. In Saint-Tropez, the little Chez Fifine restaurant. Yes, I'm coming to the close. No worry. In Saint-Tropez, the little Chez Fifine restaurant became a word-of-mouth legend, serving vegetables and fish fresh from the market, all cooked by the formidable Fifine. In 1948, Nice held the first of its famous jazz festivals, and 2 years later, Elizabeth Gwynn, who we met earlier, sauntering through the French canals with her dubious lover, published a book of Mediterranean food under her married name, Elizabeth David, from her marriage to Lieutenant Colonel Anthony David of the Indian Army, though the union did not last very long. So here you go. There she is. Now, this classic of culinary literature was scribbled down in a freezing Ross-en-Y hotel, partly as a distraction from a fading love affair, for this happened a lot to Elizabeth David, and partly to recall that in ration-restricted Britain, the sunshine, the abundant food, and wonderful cooking around the Mediterranean. There was a dark side, however, to the war's end in the south of France, involving a wave of extrajudicial killings and public humiliations and of suspected collabos or collaborators. The first phase was called the Opération Sauvage, the Wild Purge, with a bloody ad hoc settling of scores, especially women suspected of relationships with Germans who had their heads shaved. The second phase was the Opération Légale, the legal purge, held by special commissions set up by de Gaulle, with around 120,000 receiving various sentences, the mildest punishment being loss of civil rights, with some offenders being allowed to serve with the French Foreign Legion. In total, of those executed, both legally and illegal, it varies between 10 to 80,000, depending on the source of information. And for both Pierre Laval and Marshal Pétain, summary justice came swiftly after the war. Both of them were tried for treason. Laval loudly maintained that it was a kangaroo court, but to no avail. He was sentenced to death and executed by firing squad after he attempted suicide by poison, which unfortunately for him turned out to be too old. Pétain was also sentenced to death, but it was commuted to life imprisonment on de Gaulle's orders. He was banished to the Ile de Yeux on the French west coast, and he died and he was buried in 1951. But in 1973, there was a strange incident when some Pétain supporters decided to steal his coffin and take it over to the Verdun war grave and put him in there. But they were apprehended halfway along outside Paris, and his coffin was taken back, and it's now back in the Ile de Yeux cemetery. So, as we come to the end, I'd like to finish here with one final look at the south of France, with Scott Fitzgerald as our guide. When your eyes first fall upon the Mediterranean, you know at once why it was here that man first stood erect and stretched out his arms towards the sun, he wrote. Blue like blue books, blue oil, blue eyes, and in the shadow of the mountains, a green belt of land runs along the coast for 100 miles and makes a playground for the whole world. And finally, bon anniversaire, Brigitte Bardot, Queen of Saint-Tropez. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, people.